Aslamualikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wassalatu wassalamu ala khatamil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Amma ba'd, fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Ameen ya rabbil alameen. So last week we began the topic of the genealogy of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So his lineage. I'm going to summarize in a couple of minutes what we discussed in the last lesson. Yeah? So we split up the genealogy of the Prophet ﷺ into three categories. Number one, we said from the Prophet ﷺ up until Adnan, we know his exact lineage. And just as a quick quiz, how many descendants are there? How many descendants are there between Adnan and the Prophet? 20, yes. Yeah. The second category we mentioned from Adnan to Ismail alayhi salam. And we mentioned that this is somewhat of a myth. We're not 100% sure of the exact lineage, we don't know for sure. So it's somewhat of a myth. And the third category we mentioned from Ismail alayhi salam all the way up to Adam alayhi salam. And this we have to rely on Jewish sources, and we don't know about the validity of it. But we mentioned most of it is not true, because the Jewish viewpoint on human history is that we've lived for approximately 6,000 years, but science tells us that we've been around for much longer, and we as Muslims have no problem in agreeing with the science viewpoint. Yeah, so that's the summary about the lineage of the Prophet in terms of what's authentic, what's not too authentic, and what we rely completely on Jewish sources. Yeah. The other thing that we mentioned is the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he mentioned Allah chose Kinana from all of the descendants of Ismail, and he chose Quraysh from Kinana, and he chose Banu Hashim from Quraysh, and he chose me from Banu Hashim. He was talking about the nobility or the prestige of his lineage. And then we went into these names in this hadith. The first we mentioned Kinana, who was one of his descendants, and we mentioned that he was a brave and wise man, and he had many famous statements that were recorded amongst the Arabs. That was Kinana. We also mentioned Quraysh. And was Quraysh a person or was it a nickname? It was a nickname. Yeah. So Quraysh wasn't actually a man. So there's differing opinions as to who Quraysh actually was. But the most common opinion is that it was Fihr. And why was that the most common opinion? Because all of the sub-tribes at the time of the Prophet, they all had a common ancestor in Fihr. They all united under Fihr. So that's why the scholars say Fihr was the one that was Quraysh. And then we began to mention Qusay. And the things that we mentioned were that he wrestled the power of Mecca back to the Quraysh. Because Quraysh had lost the power of Mecca, but Qusay was the one who brought the power back to the Quraysh from Khuza'ah. The other thing that we mentioned is he established Darul Nadwa, which was the parliament of the Arabs, and they used that same building at the time of the Prophet. And the Prophet ﷺ himself also used to use Darul Nadwa. And it was Qusay who established that. And the last thing we mentioned from Qusay was that he assigned responsibilities to the various tribes. At the time of the Prophet, the tribes used to have different responsibilities. One would have the key to the Kaaba, one would feed the pilgrims, etc., etc. It was Qusay who gave out these responsibilities. So that was a summary of the last lesson. I'm just going to mention a couple more things about Qusay, and then we'll move on to the next person in this hadith. The other thing I didn't mention last week from Qusay was that he used to also provide water for the Hujjaj by digging up a well. So he dug up a well, and why was this? He dug a well up because the well of Zamzam that we know of today, which is in the Haram, the well of Zamzam was missing for a number of years. So at the time of Qusay, there was no well of Zamzam because it had been missing for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what Qusay did is he built a separate well that was a little bit far, and he would provide water for the pilgrims with that well. So the question arises, why did the well of Zamzam go missing? What's the story behind that? And the story goes as follows. If we remember from the last lesson, we mentioned that Khuza'ah took over the power of Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula from Jurhum. Yeah, we mentioned this, remember. We mentioned that Ismail alayhi salam, he married into Jurhum, and then Jurhum lost power to Khuza'ah. Yeah. So when Khuza'a attacked Jurhum, Jurhum realized that they're going to lose this battle. They're going to lose the war. So what they did is they said, let us hide the well of Zamzam, so that Khuza'a are going to struggle without Zamzam. So they hid, the tribe of Jurhum, they hid the well of Zamzam, and for hundreds of years, the well of Zamzam was missing. So anyone that lived in Mecca, it was difficult for them. Because on one hand, they want to live in Mecca. Why? Because they realize it's a holy land. People come here for Hajj. They don't want to leave Mecca, but their life is difficult. Because to get water, they would have to travel in order to get water. So Jurhum, because they knew they were going to lose the battle, they hid Zamzam. So for over 300 years at least, people were forced to leave Mecca just to get water. And that was one thing that Qusay did, is he built a nearby well for the people to get water. And now the reason for bringing this topic up is very important, because at the end of this halaqah, inshallah, we're going to mention the story of Abdul Muttalib. And he is very important when it comes to the well of Zamzam. But anyway, as the hadith continues, the one that we mentioned last week and the beginning of this reminder, the next person in the hadith is Hashim. Who was Hashim? Who was Hashim? How was he related to the Prophet? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Not grandfather, great-grandfather. So the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's grandfather was Abdul Muttalib. His father was Hashim. So who is Hashim? Which tribe was the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam from? He was from Banu Hashim, right? So it comes from him. So Hashim was his great-grandfather. And this is where we get the tribe of Banu Hashim from. So Hashim, that wasn't his real name. It was a kunya. His real name was actually Amr. And the reason why he was called Hashim, because it comes from the word Hashama. And Hashama means to grind. And the reason why he was called Hashim is because he would grind food and give it to the pilgrims. And this is one of the things that he was known for. He would give food to the pilgrims. In fact, the people used to say that Hashim would never eat food by himself. Every time he would eat, he was seen to be eating with another person, because he was very generous. If he wanted to eat something in public, he would always call somebody to eat with him. Yeah, so this is one of the things that Hashim was known for. But perhaps the most important thing that Hashim did in his lifetime, which really made his legacy, was he raised the economic level of the Quraysh to a level in which it had never reached before. Yeah? So we mentioned Qusay last week, and he was responsible for raising the political status of the Quraysh. Now, Hashim is responsible for raising the economic status. So when we look at the lineage of the Prophet, all of these men were legendary, because they've done something very, very important. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ had the best of lineages. So when it comes to Hashim, he done the one thing that made Quraysh really, really wealthy. And what was that? It is رحلة الشتاء والصيف. Now, of course, if you've read the Quran and you heard Surah Quraysh, you would have heard this word, رحلة الشتاء والصيف. What is رحلة الشتاء والصيف? It is the journey that the Quraysh used to do. They used to make two journeys, one to the north, one to the south. And because of that, they were very, very wealthy. So what do I mean by this? I'll go into this in a little bit of detail now. So as I mentioned, it was his grandfather that was the most influential in raising the political level of the Quraysh, and it was him that was the most influential in raising the economic level of the Quraysh. So what happened was, in one particular year, there was a very severe drought. So people were dying of hunger. In this year, so many people were dying that a man would take his family and he would build a grave for his own family, because they're going to die of starvation. This is how bad it got in Mecca. And Hashim said to himself that I need to do something about this. So what he did is he said, why don't we institute two journeys? One journey in the summer and one in the winter. And what we'll do is, in the summer, we will go up to the Roman Empire in Rome. And in the winter, we will go south all the way to Yemen. And this is what we know as رحلة الشتاء والصيف. Now, what was the real genius behind this? Why was this such a good move? And I'll explain this now. Because what is one of the most important things about business? If somebody wants to be successful in business, one of the most important things is the location of the business. Even if we look in Luton, for example, where we currently live, or where currently are right now, The most successful businesses in Luton are in the busiest of places, correct? And anywhere you go, the best businesses, they strategically choose the correct location where there's a lot of foot flow, a lot of people are coming to this area. This is where there's opportunity for money. So the reason why Hashim was so smart and clever, he realized that everyone is already coming to us. People are coming for Hajj. Why? Because from the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam, for years and years and years, people are coming to Mecca every single year. And he realized we're sitting on a gold mine here. So why don't we use this opportunity to sell things to everybody that's coming through Mecca anyway? So let us sell them goods, because we don't have many goods ourselves. So let's go, we'll travel, we'll buy some goods, so that when people come through Mecca, we will sell it and it will raise our economic level. And he thought to himself, what are the most famous trade routes in the world right now? So when it comes to Yemen, if you want any Indian goods or African goods, all of them were in Yemen. Because Yemen was a perfect location if you want to buy Indian spices, for example. You know, Indian spices are famous right now, but they've been famous for years and years. Even at the time of the Prophet, Indian spices were very well known, and people across the whole world wanted them. So if you wanted things from Africa or you wanted things from India, you would have to go through Yemen. So Hashim said, if we do a yearly trip and we go down to Yemen, we can get all of these things and bring it with us to Mecca, and anyone that comes to Mecca for Hajj, we can sell them these things. At the same time, if we want any goods from the north, then we can be connected to the Silk Road. Who's heard of the Silk Road? Silk Road is one of the most famous roads in human history. Why? Because it would connect the Eastern world and the Western world. It was the road that literally raised the economic level of the whole world. Why? Because the way people used to trade from the East and the West was through the Silk Road. And they would, the reason why it's called Silk Road is they used to collect silk and travel through this road to exchange it across the world, amongst other things. So Busra, or no, not Busra, Bosra and Damascus, they were also connected to the Silk Road. So once a year, Hashim said, why don't we go and connect to the Silk Road in the north, in the Roman Empire? We'll collect our goods, bring it back to Mecca, so that we are bringing things from all over the world. People are coming to us and we'll sell them goods. So as a result of this, Hashim became a very, very wealthy man. And as a result of this, the Quraysh raised their economic status. So Mecca became connected to the lifeline of the world because of this. It was a new road that joined Yemen and the Silk Road in the north. And people are coming up and down to do Hajj. So he became a very, very wealthy man. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Surah Quraysh in the Quran. We've all heard the surah, the shortest surah in the Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لإيلاف قريش إيلافهم رحلة الشتاء والصيف فليعبدوا رب هذا البيت الذي أطعمهم من جوع وآمنهم من خوف. And the translation goes as follows: for the taming of the Quraysh, the caravans to set forth safe in winter to the south and in summer. So let them worship the Lord of the house, who has fed them against hunger and has made them safe from fear. So why is Allah reminding the Quraysh in this surah that it's me, I'm the one who gave you the money, so that you no longer have to fear for hunger and poverty. You don't have to fear for these things. I am the one that gave you the protection of the Kaaba, so worship the Lord of the Kaaba. So Allah is reminding us in Surah Quraysh that it's not because of you that you are wealthy. I'm the one that gave you these blessings. And you have the izzah of protecting the Kaaba. So worship the one who is the Lord of the Kaaba. SubhanAllah. And this is where we hear Rehmat al-Shita'i wal-Sayf. It was Hashim that came up with this idea. So he was a real genius. So as we see from last lesson and this lesson, when we went through the Prophet's lineage and we mentioned this hadith, we see that through every generation going down to the Prophet, the legend and the prestige of the Prophet's lineage is growing better and better. Every person in his lineage is raising the status of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is the hikmah that Allah revealed the Prophet to be the best of the best of the best. And we've mentioned this a few times. And these are the legends that the Prophet ﷺ had in his lineage. Another thing to mention is because Hashim became so wealthy, it started to create jealousy amongst those around him. Especially his brother, and his brother was Abd al-Shams, and his nephew was Umayyah. And this is why at the time of the Prophet, and even years after the Prophet ﷺ left this world, even in the time of the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasty, there was a great rivalry between the Banu Hashim and the Banu Abdul Shams, or the Banu Umayyah. They used to have this rivalry amongst each other, that one tribe is better than the other. And that rivalry started with Hashim, because Hashim became a very wealthy man, and his brother Abdul Shams became very jealous. And this is where this rivalry began. One thing to mention is Hashim, he married a number of women, and this was common at that time, that men used to marry multiple women in their lifetime, and Hashim done the same. Now subhanAllah, look at the hikmah here. One of his wives was actually from Yathrib, which is Medina. Yeah? And subhanAllah, look how Allah is planning that the Prophet is going to have connections with Yathrib. And later when he migrates, he has connections with the city of Medina. So one of his wives was from Yathrib, and this was not common at the time, by the way. You know, someone that has high nobility and status, they would typically marry within Mecca. They wouldn't marry outside of Mecca. But one of his wives happened to be from Yathrib. So that's why when the Prophet ﷺ migrates later, and we go through this in the Seerah, he sees that he has some relatives that are already living in Yathrib, Medina. For example, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He's a distant relative to the Prophet, because Hashim had a wife in Yathrib. So Hashim, he eventually passed away while he was trading in Gaza. So Gaza in Palestine today. Hashim was in Gaza on a trade, and he passed away in Gaza. And that's why one of the names of the city of Gaza till this day is Gaza to Hashim. That's actually one of the names of Gaza. And Hashim is actually buried there, and he died in Gaza. So who was Hashim's son? The grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ. And the next person we're going to speak about, Abdul Muttalib. So when Hashim died, his wife took his son, who is Abdul Muttalib, back to her hometown. So Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather of the Prophet, was actually raised in Yathrib. His early childhood years was actually in Yathrib. And subhanAllah, this is the connection between the Prophet ﷺ and Medina, or Yathrib, which was known at the time. And his real name was also not Abdul Muttalib. His real name was Shaybatul Hamd. That's the real name of Abdul Muttalib. Now what does Shaybatul Hamd mean? Where did this come from? So Abdul Muttalib was born with white hair, which is very uncommon. You know, it's possible, I think the term is called albinos, correct me if I'm wrong. But some people are born with white hairs. Yeah? So Abdul Muttalib, or Shaybatul Hamd, he was born with white hair. And this is where the Shayba part comes from, because Shayba means white hair. So he was born with white hair, and the people would say at the time, this is the Shayba of praise. And this is where the name Shaybatul Hamd came from, because Hamd means praise, correct? So Shaybatul Hamd is the name that was given to him at his birth, and that's his real name. Another thing to mention is when Hashim passed away, his wife was still pregnant with Abdul Muttalib. So a lot of people didn't even know in Yathrib that this is the son of Hashim. So those that were living in Medina at the time, or Yathrib at the time, they didn't know that this is the son of Hashim. They just thought this is a woman that's living here, and she is a widow, and she's raising a child. Why? Because she was still pregnant when Hashim died. So she went back to Medina, or Yathrib, and Abdul Muttalib is raised in Medina without anyone actually knowing that he is from Quraysh. Until one day, his uncle, who his name was Muttalib. So Abdul Muttalib, his uncle, his name is Muttalib. Yeah? So Muttalib came to Yathrib, and he saw him, and he recognized his features. And he said, this is my blood, this is my nephew. And he recognized that this was the wife of my brother, Hashim, and he has the same features as my family. This is my blood. He has to be from my blood. So he created a plot and a plan, and he basically took Abdul Muttalib, or Shaybatul Hamd, and he took him back with him to Mecca. So he made this ploy. And there's different opinions. Some say that the mother of Abdul Muttalib agreed that she was going to let him go. Some say she didn't know. But this was the story of how his uncle took him back to Mecca with him. So how was he given the name Abdul Muttalib when his name is Shaybatul Hamd? It is said that when Muttalib was bringing his nephew to Mecca, the people saw in the distance that Muttalib is coming back to Mecca, and he's bringing a slave with him. So they started to call him Abdul Muttalib, the slave of Muttalib, not realizing that this is his nephew. So his name from then on started being Abdul Muttalib, and that's what he was known by. Does everybody understand that? Yeah? So this is how he got the name Abdul Muttalib. Now, because of time, there's a lot to talk about Abdul Muttalib, but we're going to summarize it in 3 stories in terms of his legacy and what he brought to the legacy of the Prophet ﷺ. There are 3 main stories that we're going to discuss. The first one is the recovery of Zamzam. If you remember at the beginning of this halaqah, we mentioned that for over 300 years the well of Zamzam was missing, correct? So Abdul Muttalib, he once had a dream that was from Allah SWT. And in the dream, Allah told Abdul Muttalib the exact location of where Zamzam is. So Abdul Muttalib ignored the dream at first, but then he kept getting the same dream again and again, that this exact location, in between these mountains, in this specific location, is the well of Zamzam. And after he had this dream multiple times, he said to himself, this must be from Allah. So one day, and by the way, at the time when he had this dream, he only had one son, Abdul Muttalib. And his son was Harith, I believe. So this is where he got the kunya Abu al-Harith. So at the time people used to call him Abu al-Harith, which was his kunya. So he took his only son at the time, and the two of them began digging. And people started laughing at him. What are you digging for? For over 300 years, nearly 400 years, nobody's found Zamzam, and you just think you found Zamzam all of a sudden. But he ignored the people and he kept digging. He was digging and digging until, lo and behold, the well of Zamzam springs forth. And everyone's looking like, wow, after this many years, he's found Zamzam, the well of Zamzam. So all of his own relatives, the Quraysh, they started fighting amongst each other. That we have the rights of the well of Zamzam. And Abdul Muttalib is saying to them that, no, I'm the one that found it. I have the rights of the well of Zamzam. And what had happened is the family members were fighting amongst each other until all-out war was about to take place. A civil war was about to take place, that we are going to have the rights of Zamzam. And why is a war going to happen between families? Because they realize that everyone's going to drink from Zamzam, but the ones who are responsible for Zamzam in terms of its rights, there's going to be great izzah in that. There's going to be great honor in that. So that's why they wanted the rights of it. So they were about to have a war amongst each other, and that is the time where Abdul Muttalib made a promise when they were about to fight. And he said, oh Allah, if you ever give me 10 sons to defend me, then I promise I will sacrifice one for you. He made an oath to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect him when they were about to fight. If I haven't given 10 sons, I'm going to sacrifice one for you. But then what happened is, the people, the family members, the Quraysh, they agreed, we're not going to fight over this. Rather, they said, we're going to go to a fortune teller, a priestess, and she's going to tell us what we need to do. So what happened is they had agreed, and they were on their way to go to the priestess until they had got lost. They were supposed to go, all these people, Abdul Muttalib and his family members, they were on the way to the fortune teller, but they got lost in the desert. And they were about to die of thirst in the desert when they got lost. And when they were about to die, Abdul Muttalib said to them, each and every one of you dig your own grave, because we're going to be too weak to bury each other. Everybody dig their own graves, Abdul Muttalib said to his family members. So they all started digging their own grave until Abdul Muttalib hit the ground and water started coming out. Again, for the second time now. And all his family members said that this is a sign from Allah, that we're going to a priestess to tell us who has the rights of Zamzam. Abdul Muttalib has once again hit some water. And they said, this must be a sign from Allah, that if we get back to Mecca, the rights of the well of Zamzam will be given to Abdul Muttalib. So they got water, they found their way back to Mecca, and then eventually they voluntarily gave up the rights of Zamzam to Abdul Muttalib. So they went back to Mecca, and Abdul Muttalib had the rights of the well of Zamzam. So the next story that I'm going to mention is the sacrifice of his son. He made that promise earlier, right? That if Allah gives me 10 sons, I'm going to sacrifice. So who were the children of Abdul Muttalib? Abdul Muttalib, just guesses, if anyone wants to guess, how many children did Abdul Muttalib have? Just a guess, anyone? 10? Yeah, he had 10 sons, according to the most common narration, but he also had 6 daughters. And some narrations mention he had 12 sons. Yeah, so the most famous in Ibn Hisham, he states that Abdul Muttalib had 10 sons, and Ibn Sa'ad states that Abdul Muttalib had 12 sons. So who were his sons? Number 1 was Harith. As I mentioned, his kunya was Abu al-Harith, right? So Harith was his eldest. Then his next sons were Zubayr, Abdullah, the father of the Prophet ﷺ, and Abu Talib. And these three brothers were all from the same mother. So Zubayr, Abdullah, Abu Talib were all from the same mother. The fifth son was Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, and Dirar, and they were from another mother. So Abbas and Dirar had the same mother and father. The next was Hamza radiallahu anh, Muqawwam, and Hajj. And all three of these were from another mother. And then the last and 10th son that is mentioned by name was Abu Lahab. So he himself was born from a separate mother. Abdul Muttalib had obviously a number of wives, and these were his 10 sons. As for his 6 daughters, one of his daughters was Safiya, and of course, this is the famous aunt of the Prophet ﷺ, the only aunt whose story we know confirmed that she became a Muslim at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So that was one of the aunties of the Prophet, or the daughters of Abdul Muttalib. The other was Atika, who was alive when the Prophet ﷺ was preaching. The next daughter was Hakim, and then you have Umayma, who was the mother of Zainab bint Jahsh, who was the wife of the Prophet. And the last couple of daughters of Abdul Muttalib were Arwa and Barra. Yeah? So these were the 6 daughters of Abdul Muttalib. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Abdul Muttalib 10 sons. And what was his promise? That if I have 10 sons, I'm going to sacrifice one. So he was a man of his word. So he was ready to sacrifice his favorite son. And his favorite son was his youngest, Abdullah. So he was ready to sacrifice him. But then the people of Quraysh said, he's your favorite son. Why are you going to sacrifice your favorite son? Go to another fortune teller or priestess and find a way that you can save him. So he went, the story goes as follows. Abdul Muttalib goes to this priestess and they begin to draw lots in terms of arrows. At the time they used to draw lots in terms of arrows. That if an arrow gives me a sign, I'm going to do something. And the story goes where Abdul Muttalib, he drew the arrow, and if it went in terms of favor of killing his son, it was one side, and the other side was sacrificing 10 camels. That was the only way his son would be saved. So they drew the arrow on the floor 10 times until eventually 100 camels had to get sacrificed instead, so that Abdullah can survive and live. And this is where it actually comes in Sharia, where there's a rule that a life is worth 100 camels. Until this day, it's part of our Sharia. If you accidentally kill someone, the blood money is 100 camels. And that comes from the story of Abdul Muttalib. Abdullah was saved from being sacrificed, and as a result of that, 100 camels were sacrificed by Abdul Muttalib. So that was the second story. The third story was the story of the elephant. And inshallah, we'll conclude with this story today. And this is the story of Abraha. And this is where we get Surah Al-Fil, the story of Surah Al-Fil. So who was Abraha, and why did he want to destroy the Kaaba? You know, when we were younger, we probably heard the story of Abraha. How did it happen? Why did he want to destroy the Kaaba? So Abraha was the governor of Yemen under the rule of Najashi. This is not the same Najashi at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. This is the father of Najashi, who was also called Najashi. So the same ruler of Abyssinia at the time of the Prophet, his father was called Najashi. So under the rule of Najashi, Abraha was the governor of Yemen. And he would see people every year go to Mecca for Hajj, and he would ask them, why are you going to Mecca? And the people would say, we're going to the house of Allah. And he would say, there's a house of Allah in Mecca. I'm going to create a house better than the Kaaba. Na'udhu billah. This is what Abraha said. He said, I'm going to create a cathedral that is even better than the Kaaba. So he made a super fancy cathedral made of stained glass. And he said, people will come to my house rather than going to the Kaaba. So one day, a Bedouin man went inside the cathedral and he used the cathedral to relieve himself, to go to the toilet. So Abraha was so angry at this, he said, this man has come to my cathedral to use the toilet, I'm going to destroy the Kaaba as a result of this. So that nobody goes to the Kaaba and only comes to my cathedral. So Abraha gathered his army and he brought, some narrations say, 8 elephants. Because remember, he's from Abyssinia, which is Africa, right? And you have African elephants, the biggest elephants in the world. So he brought elephants and he gathered an army and he said, I'm going to destroy the Kaaba with this army. Some narrations say he brought 8 elephants, some say he brought 20 elephants in his army. So he went with his army, and the chief elephant, his name was Mahmud, the chief elephant of this army. And also, Abraha hired an Arab guide to teach him how to go into Mecca, go to the Kaaba, so the Kaaba can be destroyed. Now the name of this Arab guide was Abu Rughal. And for years, even after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, there was a famous Arabic statement. And the statement is translated to, more treacherous than Abu Rughal. So if somebody does some sort of treachery or trickery, they would say the statement, you are more treacherous than Abu Rughal. And why did they used to say this famous statement? Because you have to have no honor to trade your honor for money. And that's what he did. Can you imagine being an Arab, and because someone's giving you money, you're happy to destroy the Kaaba, or tell someone the way to destroy the Kaaba just for the sake of money. You're giving up all of your honor. And that's why they would have this expression that you are more treacherous than Abu Rughal. So to cut a long story short, when Abraha entered Mecca, he captured Abdul Muttalib's livestock. And this is why we're mentioning this story, because he's linked to Abdul Muttalib. So Abdul Muttalib was a very wealthy man. Why? Because we mentioned his lineage, his story, and how he was given the rights to Zamzam, so he became very wealthy. So Abraha, as soon as he entered Mecca, he took over 200 camels and sheep that all belonged to Abdul Muttalib. And he captured them. And he brought them. And this again shows how rich Abdul Muttalib became. So the story goes that Abdul Muttalib came to Abraha and he entered his tent. And when Abraha saw Abdul Muttalib, he was in awe of him. Why? Because it said Abdul Muttalib was a very tall and handsome man. He was very handsome in his features. So Abraha, he stood up when Abdul Muttalib came in because he was in awe of him. And one narration mentions that he actually sat on the floor with him because, he was in awe of his stature. So Abraha said to Abdul Muttalib, I haven't got a problem with you. It's not for you that I'm here. You just get out of the city and I am going to destroy your house. That's why I came here. And I have no problem with you guys. This is nothing personal. And Abdul Muttalib, what was his response? He said, I have not come here to talk about the Kaaba. I came to you to talk about my camels. That don't worry about the Kaaba. I've come just to get my camels back. And when Abdul Muttalib said this, Abraha lost respect for him. That, do you not have any honor or love for the Kaaba? I've come here telling you that I'm going to destroy the Kaaba, but you're more interested in your camels. And subhanAllah, what was the response of Abdul Muttalib? A very wise response. He said, it's not my business. The house has a Lord who will protect it, and the camels have a Lord. And it is my job to protect the camels. And this is a legendary one-liner. That I'm not going to be the one that protects the Kaaba. That the Kaaba has its own Lord, and He is the one that's going to protect it. And I've come here because these camels are under my protection, and I'm going to get my camels back. So Abdul Muttalib, it said that he began pleading in front of the Kaaba, and he made a dua. And he said, oh Allah, we cannot fight this army. They're too strong for us. They have these elephants. They have these thousands of men. You take care of it. And then it said that when they faced Mahmud to the Kaaba, they told Mahmud, who was the chief elephant, go towards the Kaaba. And even if they whipped Mahmud and told him to go in that direction, Mahmud wouldn't go in that direction. And this was a miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in that He wouldn't allow the army of Abraha to march towards the Kaaba. And whenever they would move, the elephant wouldn't move. And this is why in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, when we study later on and we talk about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Prophet ﷺ's camel stopped at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And the Prophet said, don't get angry at my camel. The same one who stopped the elephant from entering Mecca has stopped my camel as well. And this is why the Prophet mentions this at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. That Allah stopped my camel, just like Allah stopped the elephant of Abraha to go and destroy the Kaaba. And then the story goes as follows, as we read in Surah Al-Fil, stones from Jahannam were sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to destroy the army of Abraha. And in front of their very own eyes, every stone would hit an animal and a person, and they would disintegrate into nothing. SubhanAllah, the stones from Jahannam would come. And their skin would dissolve, and they would become a pile of molten lava on the floor. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed the army of Abraha. And it said Abraha had the worst death of them all. He suffered the worst fate. They would carry him on his back, and his skin was dissolving the whole way, and just as he was about to arrive back to Yemen, he died right before then. And this is how Abraha died. And it's mentioned that the traces of the elephants were still there when the Prophet ﷺ was born. And this is why they say the Prophet ﷺ was born in the year of the elephant, because it was that same year the Prophet ﷺ was born. And as he was born, the remains of the elephants were still there. In fact, one of the Sahaba, his name was Qubath ibn Ashyam, he mentioned, and by the way, he's a famous companion who makes a famous narration in Tirmidhi, where one of the early Umayyad Khalifs asks him, "Are you bigger or the Prophet ﷺ?" So this person, this caliphate, is asking him, "Are you bigger or the Prophet?" What he means is, "Are you older?" But he uses the phrase bigger. So Qubath says, "The Prophet ﷺ is bigger than me, but I was born before him." So he was teaching him that this is not the right word to use. You saying, "Are you bigger than the Prophet?" No, the Prophet is bigger than me. But I understand what you're asking me. So the answer is, he is bigger than me, but I am older than him. So he is remembering that he was born just before the Prophet ﷺ. And he says, the Prophet is bigger than me, but I was before him. I remember my mother taking me and show me the defecations of the elephants that had withered and become yellow. I saw the elephants and their defecations when I was a young boy. So he remembers it was still there when the Prophet was born. And Aisha radiallahu anha says, I remember one of the guys, he must have been a young man at the time, now he is an old man about to die, and he is still begging for food. And this was one of the men in the army of Abraha, and Aisha radiallahu anha says, I remember this man, he is an old man about to die, but he is still begging. Allah has dishonored him. This man is begging as a punishment for what he did as part of the army of Abraham. So just to conclude and summarize today's lesson now, the Prophet ﷺ's lineage, what does it show us? We mentioned all of these famous men in the lineage of the Prophet in his genealogy. What does it show us? It shows us that something truly momentous is about to happen. All these legendary people are coming. It is coming up to a grand finale. That a legendary man is about to be born. And that is the Prophet ﷺ. Allah chose, as we mentioned multiple times, his lineage to be the best of the best. At Hunayn, and later on when we talk about the Battle of Hunayn, the Prophet ﷺ says the statement, I am the Prophet, there is no doubt. I am the son or the grandson of Abdul Muttalib. So when he was gathering the people at Hunayn, which we will see later on, he says, I am the grandson of Abdul Muttalib. Why does he mention that? He says, I am the Prophet, but then he mentions, I am the grandson of Abdul Muttalib. Why? Because he realizes that everybody knows how amazing Abdul Muttalib was, how grand his name was, how prestigious his name was. How prestigious was Abdul Muttalib? He was the most prestigious man of Quraysh when he was alive. Why? Because he himself was prestigious, his father was prestigious, his great-grandfather was prestigious, and his grandfather was prestigious. So all these men in his lineage were amazing, legendary figures. And subhanAllah, the last point I'll mention in today's reminder is that there are two ancestors of the Prophet that are ransomed and saved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first in the Prophet's lineage and the last in the Prophet's lineage. Ismail alayhi salam was saved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from being sacrificed, the first person in the lineage, and the last person in the lineage, Abdullah, was also saved from being sacrificed. And this shows, subhanAllah, that Allah is blessing his ancestry. And this is the lineage of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was born in the year of the elephant. And inshallah, in the next lesson, we'll talk about the actual birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's all for today. Any good that came from this reminder, inshallah, is from Allah. Any bad will come from my own mistakes. Jazakallah khair. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.